Vinland Saga was easily the most underrated series of 2019. And I guess it was underrated because the people couldn't handle my 7 feet, 5 inches, 400 pounds Torkel running around playing Fruit Ninja on the battlefield. Well, apart from the series being underrated and Viking guts flying to the screen every other scene, nobody could argue with the fact that Vinland Saga isn't a good story. For me, it was truly the antagonist of the story, Askeladd, that was the driving force behind season 1 of Vinland Saga. And I get it, many people hate this following character because he shot up Thor with 10 million arrows like he was a Crip in Blood territory. He allowed a mass genocide of a village of some good old Christians. And my man's even emotionally trapped Thorfinn to the point where he turned from a Pixar main character into an emo SoundCloud rapper. Despite all the horrific things he has done, none of you guys could argue with the fact that Askeladd is a brilliantly written character. But before we do a deep dive of Askeladd, let's look at the origins of his actual name. The character Askeladd is loosely based off the famous Norwegian folktale character Askeladdin. Askeladdin was always shown as a small man that always seems to win, which in our case, that's how things usually played out. And in many of these old folktales, the main narrative is usually that Askeladdin is both born the youngest of his brothers and is at a disadvantage in terms of success. As many of these folktales unfold, he was able to overcome his brothers through sheer creativity, which all derived from him being different. Now, when we look at Vinland's Askeladd, these story parallels all start to make sense. Not only was Askeladd the youngest of his brothers, but he and his mother was also kicked out of the main household and had to sleep in horse shit. And this is where the story gets twisted because after Askeladd's mother's mind broke, she started to run around like a titan. And this is the point where Askeladd made a promise to himself that he was going to take everything from his father. So what ended up happening was that he was able to get invited back to the main household due to him displaying his fighting potential. He spent the next years learning everything he could from his father: war tactics, swordsmanship, politics, and archery. And when he was finally filled to the brim in terms of these different fields, he struck his father at the least expected. His father died in the most miserable fashion, as a butt-naked man with the same face as the screen painting and with his own sword empalmed deep into his chest. And if this wasn't savage enough, Askeladd blamed everything on a sibling that was currently in a sour relationship with his father around the time. And what unfolded after was straight up the American Civil War. The whole event truly echoes the saying of, no matter how grand an empire is, all great empires die from within. The father totally thought that bringing in Askeladd was doing him a huge favor, but what he didn't know was that my man's was actually really poisoning his well. And the reason why this whole situation gets my stamp of approval is that Askeladd found great pleasure in all of this. Slaying down his own father in his miserable butt-naked self, slaying down a hoe, and seeing his half-brothers killing each other like the Game of Thrones. My Korean revenge side is boiling and I love it. Now let's switch gears and get into present-day Askeladd. I truly feel that throughout the series, his biggest advantage was that he was calm. And what I mean by that is that most Vikings around this time, when something triggers them, their first reaction is usually pulling out their sword, which ultimately always leads to their death. But what Askeladd was very good at was using his brain. And for someone to be more proactive than reactive, especially in situations where he was getting chased by a Norwegian Yao Ming, this was a big fucking advantage. He was able to effectively lead his men like 10 steps ahead most adversaries, and he always had a 360 view understanding of his current situation. This rare attribute of calmness all derives from his rough childhood. He was really able to develop patience from holding himself back from killing someone he absolutely hated, and not only that, he was able to disguise himself so well he even learned from his worst enemy. This skill of patience really translated really well into Askeladd's adulthood. Now, with every positive attribute, there will always be a negative counterpart. One of the overarching themes in Vinland was the question of, what are you a slave of? Thorfinn's slave was avenging his father's death. Askeladd's Viking's slave was pillaging villages and indulging in worldly pleasures. Thorkel's slave was war and violence. In Askeladd's case, his slave was his attachment to his past and his relationship to his mother. If anybody even remotely insulted his mother, he goes complete apeshit. And we see this play out many times throughout the series, where if somebody insults his mother, for a brief moment, Askeladd's whole demeanor changes. And this trigger ultimately blew up in Askeladd's face. Which leads to the last thing I want to talk about, which is his death in the last episode. This was truly one of the greatest anime deaths in a very long time. At the festival where the Viking King and his cohorts were celebrating the prince's recent defeat of Thorkel, they wanted to take down Askeladd due to their intimidation of his prudence and insights. By coincidence, they stumbled upon his absolute kryptonite, which was launching an all-wage war against Askeladd's mother's ancestral home, the Welsh. And because the king realized that he was able to find Askeladd's weak point, he decided it was a very good idea to taunt Askeladd further by calling his mom a whore. And as I made my point in the last segment, Askeladd lost all coolness and his mind went blank. So to save the prince and his true home and to redeem his mother's honor, he straight up chopped the king's head off in front of everyone. And what unfolded after was straight out of a scene from 300. My man's Askeladd was chopping people's heads off left and right, and knowing that he completely fucked up, his immense intelligence kicked in one last time. And in order to salvage this complete screw up, he cued the prince to take the role as the new king and kill him. The prince stabs Askeladd in the heart and Askeladd slowly bleeds to death. Not only did he kill a washed up king, by the way, boy, you so ugly, you make Jabba the Hutt look like a snack. He also promoted his master, the prince, to the King of England, and he finally freed Thorfinn from the shackles of his past. I'm telling you, crying and getting goosebumps at the same time is one hell of a feeling. Askeladd's death reminded me of Lelouch's death in Code Geass. They both had very sad childhoods and similar relationships with their fathers. And ultimately what they did was they geniusly orchestrated their death so that they get labeled as a monster and perfectly time it so that the quote-unquote hero slays this monster to end an age of tyranny. Just as Christ has done in the New Testament for Christians, both Askeladd and Lelouch took the entirety of sin and blame to the grave, so that what came after their death was a rise of peace and new beginnings. When you break it down, Askeladd is a complete monster and has every right to be despised. But by what he has accomplished throughout the series, and what he truly accomplished in those 13 iconic minutes of the last episode, he has cemented himself as a complete legend. May you rest in peace, the true king of Britannia.